Hey guys, welcome to my channel. Today I asked you on Instagram to ask me anything about your real estate related questions, your investing related questions, and you guys showed up with some awesome questions. So I'm going to start going through those right now. So this question that I got is probably one of the most common questions and hurdles with getting into real estate. And really, it was just, how do I get into real estate investing with very little capital? Okay. Well, first we have to define what is very little capital, right? Very little capital could mean very different things to somebody in this position and somebody in this position. So I'm going to go through a couple different scenarios and maybe where your starting point might be based on what your perception of very little capital is. All right, so I'm going to start with, do you have a rental? So do you live in a rental home that you're renting from somebody, or an apartment or a condo? Or do you own a home that you can rent a portion of? So if you're living in your mom's house still, or your mom's basement or whatever, this is probably not going to be an option for you. But hopefully if you're living with a parent, you're in a position where you can just be kind of squirreling away money and saving as much as possible. But if you have a rental or you own a home where you can rent some portion of it out, that's going to be your place to start.
Can we turn our beds into bunk beds?
Yes.
That's how Airbnb started, right? People would rent an extra room in their house. Now, that's getting harder. Airbnb has really changed over the years, right? So now there's these people with these luxury cabins and these luxury condos and all sorts of stuff, but there still is a place for the budget-friendly traveler to rent a space in somebody else's home. Even better, if you have a house with a basement, can you separate it out and make a separate unit or something like that? So that's going to be an option, but the options that cost the least are the hardest on you and are the most inconvenience to your life. And the ones that cost more are easier, right? So like if something's easier, it costs more. If it's harder, it costs less, right? So that costs the most to your life and is the most inconvenient, but financially it's going to cost you the least. There are still people that rent rooms out of their home, or maybe it's not even renting it on Airbnb. Maybe it's getting a roommate for a space in your house or something like that. So is that possible for you to squirrel some money away? Because the biggest thing we're trying to do when getting into real estate investing is squirreling capital away. So if you have a space you can rent, can you rent your garage? There's an option, right? Like if you have a house with a garage and you can get all your stuff out of your garage and you can rent that garage out with a storage unit, you're probably not supposed to with your zoning, but if you can rent it to somebody you know and get that income, that might be a good option too. Right now, if we're entering with very little money, we're just trying to focus on capital savings so that we can invest and decrease expenses, right? Okay, so are you willing to do that? Now, I can tell you, if when I was starting out, I would have told my husband, hey, we're gonna get a roommate and rent this room out in our house to somebody on Airbnb or anybody at all, he would have told me,
Hell no. To the no, no, no. Yeah, to the no. Hell to the no. To the no, no, no.
no. And I get that. Like that's a safety thing, first of all, and that's something you have to consider, but are you willing to do that? If you're not, let's move on and look at some other options. Does an Airbnb model work in your town? So I'm sure there's some places maybe the Airbnb doesn't work for, but honestly, I live in a town that's very small and a lot of people pass through and stay here. So if an Airbnb model works in your town, could you rent something if you're not ready to buy? Could you rent a condo? Could you rent an apartment? Could you rent an affordable home? And then with permission of the owner, could you sub-rent it on Airbnb? So like rental hacking, right? Some rental owners, some landlords will allow this and some will not. I would allow it because I feel like if you have it on Airbnb, one, you're making income, and so it's going to be easier for you to pay rent. And two, it's going to be cared for better because you're checking on it more often and it's getting cleaned and maintained every day. So I know some landlords will not allow that, but many of them will. But the thing you have to keep in mind with that is there are going to be some upfront expenses. You're going to have to pay the first month's rent. You're going to have to pay a security deposit, and then you're going to have to be able to furnish that space. So those are some things to think about, but you're not having to buy a whole separate property or buy a whole separate home. And I've done another video on this, but one of my Airbnbs, it was the first one I ever experimented with. That home was one that I rented to a long-term renter for like 5 years, and he stayed there. He was a great guest, a great renter. He stayed there for a long time. He paid $700 a month. Now on Airbnb with that property, I am making between $1,400 and $2,000 a month, depending on the month and the season. So if you could rent it for $700 and then you could charge out on Airbnb, and you could make, so between 14 and 2,000, say on average like $1,600. That's $900 of income minus some utilities. That is a huge amount of money that you can be squirreling away for your next investment or saving for what your next piece in your growth chain is going to be. So hacking those rentals is a great opportunity that you really should be looking into if you want to start investing, but you're not ready to buy or not in a position where you can get a loan. So consider that. If you're in a position to buy a multifamily property. I cannot tell you how much buying a multifamily property put us ahead in our investments. Now, there are some different pieces to this. So if you buy a multifamily property and you can get a loan in it, so that's not very little capital because you're going to have some money to put down. But if you buy a multifamily property, right now in my market, there is a there is a fourplex on the market for 200, it's mid twos, I can't remember the exact price. And it cash flows now. If you bought it, it would cash flow from day one. If you buy it and you live in it yourself, so you have to live in one unit, you can get an FHA loan. So you only have to put 3.5% down and you can live in one unit, rent the others. You only have to do that for whatever your loan parameters are. So maybe 1 year, 2 years, then you move on, but you're getting your mortgage basically paid for. You're living there for free. So if you already have a property and then you buy this one and move into it, rent your old house, move into this one, live in it for whatever your loan says you have to, save up your money, and then go buy the next one and rent all those units. If you bought that fourplex and you had an old one, now you have 5 units. That's what we did. When we had one rental property, we bought a triplex, we lived in 1 unit, rented the other 2 units, and then we fixed it up, and then we moved out and rented all 3 units, plus we had our original rental property. So right then we had 4. So if you can find an affordable rental property in your community that is a multi-unit to buy, that's gonna set you light years ahead. But you gotta be willing to live in one of the units. So again, that's a bit of a sacrifice if that's not something you're willing to do. If none of these options work for you, if you don't have a house you can rent a portion out of, if you don't have the money to buy a multifamily, if you don't have the capital to jump into a rental that you can then hack and rent out on Airbnb because maybe you're not ready to have the capital to furnish it, or you don't want to put yourself in a situation where if it's not rented you can't pay the rent every month, I get it. You have to come up with more money. And so that's where a side hustle comes in. Ultimately, with real estate investing, we're trying to enhance our lives and make our lives more free and make ourselves be in a better position. You don't want to put yourself in a position that is going to expose you to a huge amount of risk and put you back. You want to be moving forward. And so if you're not quite ready, you have to come up with a way to raise your income so you can set that money aside for those investments. So maybe that means having multiple jobs. Maybe that means for a season selling something. My story, when we started out, I knew, because I had worked for other people that owned real estate, that I was going to invest in real estate, that was my long-term life plan and that was my long-term retirement plan. But I didn't get born with a golden egg in my hand, and so there had to be a way to make that happen. So I don't ever remember a time in my adult life and even my teenage life where I didn't have multiple jobs. So when I went to college, I worked for a family that had a bunch of rentals when I could come home on the weekends from school, on summers, holidays. I was a graduate teaching assistant when I got my master's degree. So I got scholarships to teach the courses in my program. And then I also had a stipend, and then I bartended and waitressed all through college. So I didn't have a job, but I never just had one job. When me and my husband got together, he was a cop. He was in the National Guard, and then for a while he did that, and that just took all of his time. And then when I got into real estate and I was starting out, I was a real estate agent. I did tax prep during tax season. I did bathroom remodels and handyman work. And then my husband had his full-time job where he was still a state trooper, and then he was in the Army, and then he also started doing real estate photography. And then when he came into the real estate world with me, he was a real estate agent, did real estate photography, real estate media, and now he does all of that and runs a food truck. And now I invest in real estate, I run a real estate brokerage, and I help with the food truck, and I also still do construction on the side, and I flip my own properties. So never in my life have I had one source of income. So it's hard. The answer is not easy. And most people will say, okay, here's all the reasons you can't do it. Here's all the reasons, well, that won't work. Well, here's all the people that have done it because they busted their butt for a while. And I think you have to look at your life as pieces and windows of your life. I've heard people talk about it in seasons. So there might be a season where you're willing to scramble and be balls to the wall and work really hard and really sacrifice on your quality time with your partner or your kids, because you know for 1 year or 2 years, I really have to buckle down. So for the rest of my years, I can be on the path that I want to be on. It's not that you say, I'm going to work like this and be miserable for my whole life and not spend time with my family, but maybe you decide for the next 10 months, this is the season and this is the decision that I'm going to make for these 10 months of my life. So that's something you have to think about. Do I want to sacrifice now in this window of my world so that I can have what I want moving forward? But ultimately, if some of these options are not options for you, then you have to have a side job or a side hustle to be able to setting that money aside where you can go on to the one of these next steps. So that's it. What can I do to get into real estate with little capital? Those are some options. And if not, you got to work on growing your capital so you can make that next step in your life. So thank you guys for these questions. I love it. Keep them coming. I'll make a video of anything you ask if I have the answers and I'm qualified. Go ahead and follow me here, subscribe to this channel, or get on my Instagram at emily.a.lopez and you can direct message me any questions that you have, and let's get them addressed and let's start working through your issues. So thanks for stopping in. Have a beautiful day. See you guys later. Happy investing.